people are starting to wake up to prohibition. And somebody that's woken up to prohibition that had a long experience with it, we've got as our next guest. His name is James Gierach. He is Vice President, Executive Vice President, and board member of LEAP. That's Law Enforcement Against Prohibition. Their website is leap.cc. Now, he's had 43 years of legal practice, including governmental bodies. He's a former Cook County drug homicide prosecutor, and he was named by an Illinois paper as Illinois' preeminent conscientious objector in the war on drugs. Hi, James. How you doing? Sorry, Jim. You want to go by Jim. That's correct.
Good to be with you.
So tell us a little bit about how you went from a prosecutor to a conscientious objector.
In the early 70s, I prosecuted drug and homicide cases, and in the early 70s in Cook County, i.e. Chicago, the best heroin you'd get was 2% pure. Jump forward 40 years, in Cook County, you can now get 90% pure heroin. The other thing that bothered me was that we had so many murders. After I left the office in 1994, after 4 years prosecuting, we had this epidemic of crime and murder. And so often it was the gangs shooting each other, fighting over who was going to control the drug business. So in one weekend in Chicago, in about 1991, we had 12 kids killed in one weekend. And some of them innocent crossfire victims, some of them participants in the drug war. But the politicians who I would listen to at the time say we need to get tough, crack down on crime, take back our streets, three-time loser laws, build some prisons. And the result was that things just got worse, and there was no choice to the public, whether Republican or Democrat. Both teams were selling the same drug war snake oil. So as the years went by, I saw that not only does the war on drugs not work, it's the most effective way to put more drugs uncontrolled and unregulated everywhere. But it's also the heart of nearly any crisis you can name in America. The problem of guns and gangs and crime, prisons, taxes, deficits, AIDS, healthcare, trade imbalance, corruption, no money for schools, job programs, the funding of terrorism. You name the crisis in America, and the war on drugs, public enemy number one, makes those problems worse. And each of them comes with a price tag, so that really, when you put them all together at the national, state, and local level, we can't pay the bills. And that is really the biggest threat to the continuation of the war on drugs. It causes so many problems for so many people in so many different ways that government can't pay the bills. And that's one of the reasons the people are fed up, and so they're expressing their view in referendums like we saw in Colorado and Washington.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've even seen jury nullification, like in New Jersey, cases like that. I mean, you know, we just talked to a fellow New Jersey weed man. He had a pound of marijuana, and he didn't even contest his innocence according to the drug laws. He said he knew that more than half of the people were against it, so he defended himself and just went for a straight jury nullification. He got a hung jury once, and then he got a complete acquittal the second trial. So,
see, I think what's really apparent from these referendums in Colorado and Washington is that there's such a gulf, a chasm between what the public mind sees as what it should be versus what the United States Congress and our federal laws say that it should be. And that is really even more important than what happens in one of 50 states. It's a stone being thrown at the war on drugs because it doesn't work, and the people recognize it, and they're expressing themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I watched Ken Burns' documentary on alcohol prohibition with my 20-year-old sons, and their first comment was, it's exactly like the war on drugs. You know, they were talking about how, what you mentioned before, it went from 2% to 90% purity. You know, the same thing happened in alcohol. They started going to really hard liquors, and as well as the violence, the corruption, all of that sort of thing.
Yeah, and the Tommy guns went to AK-47s instead of hanging off the running boards on Packards. Now it's SUVs. That's
right. That's right. Well, our war on drugs has been going on a lot longer. You know, it was Nixon that coined the term, and then you know, Reagan came along with zero tolerance and mandatory minimums. How did that affect things, you think? And as you saw, the mandatory minimums and the zero tolerance and that sort of thing kind of targeted the end user.
Well, all of these programs were designed to show zero tolerance, where in America we used to teach tolerance was a virtue. Well, but the war on drugs, intolerance became a virtue. And so now the land of the free became the prison capital of the world, as we decided we were going to make a crime out of adults voluntarily entering into a drug transaction with a willing seller and a willing buyer. We outlaw the drugs so that this plant, often cocaine, heroin, marijuana, things that are growing on a plant, become the most valuable commodity on the face of the earth. We tell the kids, don't do drugs, and then we slide a pot of gold next to the choice we tell them not to take, and we're surprised why so many kids are dropping out of school, joining a gang, shooting each other. We give addicts no alternative to get the drug to which they're addicted lawfully, so every addict becomes a crime wave. And then, as I say, we build these prisons to the point where we can't pay for schools. In California, they have 171,000 people behind bars. In Illinois, where I'm from, we have 50,000. Texas and in Florida are over 100,000. Can't pay the bills. The Global Commission on Narcotics Drugs a year ago issued its report, and it said that worldwide, the effect of the drug war is that opiate use is up 34.5%. Cocaine use worldwide is up 27%. This is over a 10-year period worldwide, and ending in 2008. And cannabis use is up 8.5% worldwide. Worldwide, just to convert those percentages into numbers, cannabis use, they estimated 160 million people around the world. Well, the United States is going broke, locking up 2.3 million.
Yeah, exactly.
If you open up an almanac or an atlas, or an almanac rather, and you can see that a huge percent of the people in the United States have used an illicit drug at one time or another. If we lock them up, we can't pay the bills for other things. That's
right. I remember when mandatory minimum first came in, they couldn't build the prisons quickly enough. So they were letting out violent offenders to put away people who had possession charges of something like marijuana. I mean, it was absolutely incredible. And you were a prosecutor. I mean, judges had no discretion under the mandatory minimums because they were mandatory. They were mandated by the federal government.
In the 1990s, the fastest growing housing in the United States was prisons. And you can't do anything less productive with a taxpayer's dollar than hire somebody to watch somebody else do nothing.
That's right.
Which is what prisons are. And it's also a lot to do with what the national transportation folks are doing nowadays.
That's right. And of course, we all pay for that in our taxes. You know, many people who don't use drugs look at this and they think that they're doing something to help their fellow man, but what they're doing is they're raising their taxes. And the government operates by force, and it's kind of like the old adage, you know, if you've got a hammer, everything looks like, if your only tool is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And so the government, you know, tries to use force against every problem. And I think, you know, people are starting to realize finally that the drug issue it's a medical problem as well as maybe a spiritual problem. I mean, there's other aspects, other ways that it can be handled, that the law enforcement aspect of it is not that great. I mean, you know, I'd like for the listeners to look up overdose in prison and look at how many stories there are about people who died of overdoses in prison. There was a mother who called the police on her son, wanted to get him off of drugs, thought putting him in jail would get him off of drugs, and instead he died of an overdose in prison. So you have to ask, what kind of a society are we going to have if we're going to do it by interdiction of force if they can't in prisons stop it with interdiction of force?
You know, we used to teach in our society that we care about one another, and we tried to teach the golden rule. Now we have it put in place, this law enforcement drug war, where we catch somebody who's violating this consensual drug law, and then we tell them, you're either going to tell us who sold you these drugs or you're going to prison forever. Sacrifice somebody else to save yourself. We seize drugs by the ton, and we prosecute them by the gram. In drug policy, one of the things I learned over the years is everything works in reverse. You sit down and you think of, well, what would be a good, sensible idea? Because drug use is not something to encourage, it should be discouraged. So I think, well, let's outlaw the drugs. Well, okay, when you outlaw them, now you take something that grows on this plant and make it so valuable that you tempt people to do the wrong thing. We think, well, drugs are bad, so let's put these anti-drug advertisements on. But the Partnership for Drug-Free America and the Ad Council making the ads, and these are your brains on drugs, and they show the scrambled eggs and the domestic fight over the sink. In fact, an anti-drug ad is a drug ad, whether you say to use the drug or don't use the drug. So again, everything works in reverse. You think, well, we just seized a ton of drugs. It would be a good idea to destroy this ton of drugs, to keep it off the streets and away from the people. But the drug cartels would want us to do that. If we are in possession of the drugs and could use it in an addict alternative program or in some kind of a lawful dispensation and control the distribution of drugs, now the cartels were no longer exclusively in control. Yeah. So the drug cartels are in favor of what we do when we destroy these drugs.
Exactly.
And why should we be working for the Al Capones and the drug cartels of Mexico and elsewhere?
Exactly. Just as we saw the end of alcohol prohibition put the Al Capones out of business, immediately after the Colorado initiative passed, Mexico and other Central and South American countries were saying that it was going to have a tremendous effect on the drug cartels down there. You know, and they have an absolute, it's not just a war on drugs, a metaphorical war. I mean, they've got a war that they have higher casualties than Afghanistan.
60,000 people killed during Philip Calderon's tour as president, using United States money, duplicating Plan Colombia and now Plan Mexico. It's just horrible. I was down there as a guest speaker in February of this year, and they had invited 38 speakers from around the world. And I have a United Nations gentleman on the stage with me who said, well, we can't legalize drugs because it would be bad for the public health. I happened to be the speaker right after him. So I get up and I walked over to my friend Antonio Mazzatelli, who represented Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean, and said, well, how is it helpful to put in place a United Nations drug policy that prohibits drugs, the Al Capone drug policy paradigm that has produced 60,000 murders in Mexico? How is that good for the public health? Why we speakers have been in town. The Mexican authorities seized 15 tons of meth in one seizure. How is that good for the public health when you have a drug policy that attracts that much drugs in one place? The seizure of a huge amount of drugs is not an evidence of drug war success, but evidence of the failure of the war on drugs and the magnitude of that failure. The bigger the seizure, the bigger the failure.
That's right, because you're just seeing the tip of an iceberg being caught there.
Sure. Well, I mean, something's wrong when you're trying to prohibit drugs and you seize it by the ton. In Chicago, we had 8 tons seized here in the last year of marijuana coming in by boxcar loads, and they branded it as a big bust for marijuana here in Chicago. And it sounds like a lot, and unless you know that the United States Department of Justice said that in the year 2008, Mexico produced 21,500 tons of marijuana. And you can see that 8 tons is a drop in the bucket, absolutely insignificant.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you know, we talked about the crime increases, the corruption increases, but one of the things that people don't think about is how the corruption to due process, you know, the violence that it's done to people, even people who are not necessarily involved in the drug trade. We've seen a lot of people over the decades get hit with, we've seen Learjets charged with being an accessory to a drug and being seized, you know, because, of course, Learjets have no due process, and neither apparently does the owner of the Learjet, because, you know, they don't charge him, but they charge the Learjet. So we've seen that kind of fantasy happening. We've seen that kind of loss of due process, and that's something that affects everybody in the country, doesn't it? As a prosecutor, I mean.
Those types of cases are known as in rem proceedings, where you're suing the object that's the naughty object. And the reason they do that is because the government wants to forfeit the drug dealer's money. They want to forfeit the property, the planes, the boats, all of this stuff, and then it becomes ours. The local law enforcement agency gets to split the money, half for the local agency and half for the federal government. So it's in the police officer's interest and law enforcement's interest and the municipality's interest to forget about the murder and the armed robbery and the rapists, because we don't get a commission for that, but we get half the money if we go do a stakeout and work the drug crime. Mm-hmm. So the incentive is to work on consensual drug crime instead of violent crime.
Exactly.
So that there's now this rift between the citizenry and law enforcement that wouldn't be there but for the war on drugs. Mm-hmm. Just as the racism in our prison system, where blacks and browns and poor people are locked up disproportionately to their drug use.
That's tremendous. Yeah. It's tremendous. Yeah, in terms of talking about ignoring regular crime, that was another thing that happened during alcohol prohibition. People saw for the first time they would go around harassing people for, the police would be harassing someone for alcohol, and right down the street a bank is getting robbed. I mean, that was kind of unprecedented. That was the first time we saw that, but it's always going to be that way with prohibition.
It's policing for profit. Which is just another vice of the war on drugs. The war on drugs, I repeat, is public enemy number one.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I've got one more question for you. We talked about alcohol prohibition and different things that brought to society, how that's paralleled the war on drugs. One of the things that it hasn't paralleled that I think is interesting, the Volstead Amendment was passed in 1920. In 1919, they had to pass a constitutional amendment to give the government the authority to prohibit something, because everybody, congressmen, senators, president, citizens, everyone realized that the federal government had no power to prohibit the possession and use of anything. So they needed a particular amendment to the Constitution. But since that happened, we have now taken the position that everything is prohibited unless expressly permitted. Could you kind of speak to that as a prosecutor? I mean, where did we lose our way in terms of respect for law and respect for a Constitution when we don't have to have an amendment to prohibit things?
Well, they're trying to justify Congress's authority to put in place the Controlled Substances Act of 1970 by relying on the Commerce Clause. And then they're also trying to use the United States Constitution as a supreme law of the land when it's in conflict with state law. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, the government is doing things to try to justify this drug war, which it has decided it wanted to fight. And it wanted to fight it because to the politicians, prohibition means votes. To the drug cartels, means money. To the good guys who are supposed to be opposed to the cartels and the drug gangs, it means money. And the consequence of that is we've got police dressed up like they're in the military, smashing through front doors to rush in and get the drugs before they're flushed down the toilet, shooting the dogs on the way in as may or may not be necessary, people being hurt, sometimes the wrong house. A man's home being the castle, a rule of anachronistic value under this war on drugs scenario, civil rights, stop and frisk laws, drugs sniffing the car, the person, or the door of the house is no longer a search. We have eroded the Bill of Rights. We have displaced morality in the Golden Rule. We have filled the prisons, closed the schools, or defunded the schools. We have a healthcare epidemic where we can't pay for healthcare, yet we encourage kids to join the drug business, shoot each other with bullet holes that are uninsured, with the bills going to the public. We've made our communities violent. We can have safe streets or drug prohibition, and the people mistakenly for a long time have asked for drug war. It's time that they demand, as they are through these referendums, demanding an end to the war on drugs, demanding an end to public enemy, number one. And LEAP, Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, at leap.cc, is helping us get there sooner.
Yes, you certainly are. I really appreciate your integrity and those people who are working with you at LEAP. I mean, it's really refreshing to hear somebody that hasn't been corrupted by the war on drugs and by prohibition. All of you there, you've seen it, and you've had the integrity to speak out against it instead of being co-opted by it, and I really appreciate that. I think all of us do, and you can teach us all a lot. So that's leap.cc. Thank you very much, Mr. Gierach. Thank you.
Thank you, David.
And if you'd like to help us get the word out about the war on drugs, about all kinds of corruption and globalist eugenicists, and please support us at prisonplanet.tv. Your subscription there helps to support our operation. One subscription can be used by multiple people, so it's a really effective tool for getting the word out. Well, that's it for tonight's Nightly News. We'll be back here tomorrow night at 7 p.m. I'm David Knight.
We have been robbed. Globalism has been a curse to this country. Everything the globalists are doing worldwide is about making you dependent. I'm getting storable food. You need it because it's the only insurance that you can 100% use. I have, family that are veterans and people like that who can't live off their Social Security, who are disabled and things, and that's why I've bought so much food. Charity starts at home. I promote what I believe in 100%, and I believe in what they're doing 100%. And the globalists do not want you to be self-sufficient. I hope you will take action, get the 6 free meals when you pay for the shipping, so that you can eat them and see that it's quality. That's why I chose eFoods. As I did my research, I tested a bunch, bought a bunch. The other stuff was like cardboard or filled with MSG or made in China. So bottom line, folks, efoodsdirect.com/Alex. Follow the banners at Infowars.com or call the toll-free number 800-409-5633. That's 800-409-5633.